Hi and welcome back. In this video, I will use the concepts of consumer and producer surplus to illustrate how we identify and calculate inefficiencies in a market. Figure A illustrates the demand and supply curves for the beer market. Let's assume the market equilibrium price is $17.50 per liter. This gives us a market equilibrium quantity of 125 liters of beer per month being produced and consumed. As discussed in previous sections, all markets that have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve will yield consumer and producer surplus. We can see this by looking at the market equilibrium price and shading the area above the market price to represent consumer surplus, and by shading the area below the market price to represent producer surplus. The equilibrium quantity in Figure A represents economic efficiency. In one of our first videos, we discussed productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. These concepts were used to describe markets in which all productive resources were being used and that the right allocation or combination of goods were being produced, so that marginal benefit was equal to marginal cost. If the entire area below the demand curve and above the supply curve is only made up of producer surplus and consumer surplus, then we can say that the market is both productive and allocative efficient. In other words, there is no space below the demand curve or above the supply curve which is empty. You will see a better understanding of this later on in this video. The entire area is either made up of consumer surplus or producer surplus, which, as you may recall, represents a benefit to either the consumer or producer. Another important point you should keep in mind is that points on the demand curve measure the marginal benefit of beer at each level of output, and points on the supply curve measure the marginal cost of beer at each output level. And the demand curve and supply curves intersect at the equilibrium output and price level, which indicates that marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost at that level. And it's this criteria where marginal benefit must equal marginal cost that is important for a market to achieve allocative efficiency. So our analysis of consumer and producer surplus provides another way of analyzing efficiency. But markets are not always efficient due to factors such as missing information, government intervention, time, or general market failures. Adam Smith stated in his book called The Wealth of Nations that the invisible hand of the market would ensure that competitive markets always send scarce resources to their highest valued use in society. But this is really only true in the most strict sense and perfect sense of a competitive market. The theory states that if every individual does what is best for themselves, that the market as a whole will be productive and allocative efficient. Although there is definitely some truth to the theory, the reality is that we do not live in a perfectly competitive and free world, which means most markets do not operate efficiently. Remember, production efficiency implied that not too little or not too much is produced, which is a very hard outcome to achieve in reality. A major implication of market inefficiencies is the overproduction or underproduction of certain goods or services. In markets around the world, regardless of political rule or economic status, underproduction or overproduction can arise due to various factors. Some of these include price and quantity regulations, such as minimum wages or quantity quotas, taxes and subsidies, such as a sugar tax or a carbon tax, externalities, such as carbon emissions, public goods and common resources, in the case of serious market failures like policing, monopolies, such as large government-run organizations, which are run ineffectively, high transaction costs normally as a result of poor governance and infrastructure or crime. Let's now use our supply and demand graphs with our consumer and producer surplus values to see if we can graphically illustrate and measure the size of the inefficiency brought about by such market interventions. In Figure A, we have our market for beer, and we can see our original supply curve and demand curve and the original corresponding consumer surplus and producer surplus values. As we saw before, consumer surplus is maximized and the producer surplus is maximized. So the market at its current equilibrium price level and equilibrium quantity level is in a state of efficiency, or to be more precise, allocative efficiency. Let's now introduce a maximum price for beer at $15 per litre. The government might want to introduce a maximum price for a certain good or service if they feel that the market or society would benefit from such a price ceiling or restriction. Perhaps the market for beer is not the greatest example for introducing a maximum price policy. In the real world, we often find maximum price restrictions for goods such as bread or rental income, or other basic goods or services which are considered critical to maintaining a functioning society. If we now introduce the maximum price level policy in our market for beer, we can see in Figure A that $15 per litre is less than the equilibrium price of $17.50 per litre. By looking at the new quantity supplied and the quantity demanded values off our curves, we can see that producers in the market will now only supply 100 litres of beer per month, while consumers will now demand 150 litres of beer per month. You can see these new quantity values by looking at points C and H in Figure A. Already you can see that there is an underproduction of beer in this market, with demand being greater than supply. And because of the price restriction or ceiling, producers are not willing to increase their production, because the price level restriction will not allow them to recover the additional marginal costs associated with more production. Because no other market changes have taken place other than the price level, we do not shift the demand curve or the supply curve. Let's now calculate the new consumer and producer surplus values to investigate how efficient the market is now that a price ceiling has been introduced. To do this, all we need to do is calculate the area underneath the demand curve and above the price level for consumer surplus, and the area below the price level and above the supply curve for producer surplus. In Figure A, you will notice that the new consumer surplus is not the entire triangle below the demand curve. This is because the quantity that is actually consumed by consumers is 100 litres per month. Although they would like 150 litres per month, the price restriction means that producers only supply 100 litres per month. So to calculate the new consumer surplus, we need to calculate the area underneath the demand curve and above the price level for the quantity that is actually supplied and consumed in the market. This new consumer surplus then will be equal to the area of the triangle defined by point G, the point where the demand curve intercepts the y-axis at the $30 point and the $20 point, plus the rectangle defined by point C, point G, the $20 point on the y-axis and the $15 point on the y-axis. This area is shaded in green. I will not go through the entire calculation process as I did in previous videos, but I encourage you to do it to see if you get the same values as I do. The new consumer surplus is now equal to $1,000. The new producer surplus, which is defined by the brown shaded triangle in Figure A, is equal to $500. This gives us a total market surplus of $1,500. Before the maximum price level restriction, the total market surplus was equal to $1,562.5, which is more than the new total surplus with the maximum price restriction. What is interesting to note is that with the maximum price level restriction, consumer surplus increased while producer surplus decreased. This makes sense because the government introduced a law which says producers are not allowed to sell their products above a certain price, which caused the price level to fall. And that what is good for consumers might not be good for producers, and so the fall in producer surplus was greater than the increase in consumer surplus, which has led to an overall market decrease in surplus. So while consumers might benefit from a price ceiling, the overall market is less efficient, and we can show this loss of efficiency by shading in the area which no longer contributes to any consumer or producer surplus. This area is shown by the striped out area between the demand and supply curve in figure A and is called the deadweight loss. This deadweight loss represents the lost surplus that the price ceiling has caused in the market. Before we end this topic, I would like to make a few closing statements. The first is that we can see the market inefficiency by considering the marginal benefit and marginal cost values. For instance, if you look at point C and point G on our graph, you will notice that at point G, the price level is higher than at point C, and that point G represents the marginal benefit value, while point C represents the marginal cost value. So in the case where there is an underproduction of a particular good, you will find that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And this makes sense because an underproduction implies that not enough is being produced. The consumers in the market value the good higher than what it costs to produce it. In our case, the marginal benefit of the 100th beer produced is greater than the marginal cost to produce it. This means producers could produce more beer profitably because the marginal cost to do so is less than the marginal benefit. Remember, efficiency is achieved when marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and only at that allocation will consumers and producers have no incentive to produce or consume more or less. The second point I would like to make is that you should be very careful how you draw and calculate the consumer surplus and producer surplus values when introducing market forces which push markets into or out of equilibrium. In our current example, where there is an underproduction of beer, we calculated our producer surplus and consumer surplus from the 100-liter quantity level. This is because producers are only producing 100 liters of beer and consumers are only consuming 100 liters of beer. What is important is that only 100 liters of beer is being consumed, and therefore you base your calculations on the 100th liter of beer quantity. Let's briefly look at an example where there is an overproduction of beer. This might occur because the government decides to guarantee breweries a buyback scheme in which any production that they do not sell in the market, the government will buy from them directly. This is a sort of market subsidy which the government might want to introduce in order to protect the survival of their breweries in the international market. In that case, what we will find is that there is an overproduction and that the subsidy would push up market prices. Let's say in our example that the new market price increases to $20 per liter. You can then see by looking at the demand curve that at a market price of $20 per liter, the market would only demand 100 liters of beer. And by looking at the supply curve, we can see that suppliers would only supply 150 liters of beer. Without the government support, producers of beer would reduce their output to match market demand. But because the government is guaranteeing to buy any surplus stock, producers will continue to supply 150 liters in the market. But the actual consumption that is taking place in the market is only 100 liters of beer. So in this case, to calculate our consumer and producer surplus, we would still use the 100 liters of beer as our point of reference, and not the 150 liter point off the supply curve. Where there is an overproduction of a good due to a subsidy, it will be the producers that benefit more than the consumers. You can see this by the relatively larger shaded area representing producer surplus compared to the area representing consumer surplus. Overall, we can see that there is still a deadweight loss in the market, which means that the market, with the government buyback scheme, is less efficient than without such a scheme.